All right, so it's my great pleasure to have a very distinguished guest on Ramjam today, Mr. Jim Matlock. Jim is a world-leading expert in the field of study around spontaneous past life memories in small children. Now, this is a fascinating topic, and I've touched on this before on Ramjam, but it is a real privilege to have a true academic specialist on the show today. Jim's background, he has a PhD in anthropology. He's currently a research fellow at the Parapsychology Foundation, which supports the scientific exploration of psychic phenomena. And Jim runs a 15-week online course on reincarnation research and theory. On Jim's bio, you can see there's a big long list of journal papers, book chapters, encyclopedia articles and videos that he's done. And most importantly, he has two major books, one which is called I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation from 2016. And more recently in 2019, Signs of Reincarnation, Exploring Beliefs, Cases and Theory, with an academic publisher, Roman and Littlefield. Jim, welcome to Ramjam.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so we just touched on those two books there, and I believe you've mentioned that you're actually working on a third one that's currently in the pipeline.
Well, I am working on a third book that will be about Stevenson. Ian Stevenson, of course, was he sort of started this line of study in 1961 when he first went into the field, working on these cases. And that book will, it's for University Press, and it will look at Stevenson's work and its reception. And so it'll take a sort of a sociological view or a philosophy of science view, and look at the way the way he worked and the way he wrote and how his work has been received.
Oh, right. I would be really interested in reading that, actually. I mean, it's really interesting to see how the broader scientific establishment would have responded to this area of research, because it really does kind of fly in the face of currently accepted paradigms around the fundamental nature of the universe and the nature of consciousness.
Well, it does in a certain way, but I think that is partly a consequence of the commitment of our current sciences to a materialistic point of view. That is, they take the view that that everything is at basis material, right? That it all starts with the material, and that consciousness, therefore, arises from the brain. It's produced by the brain. Consciousness is produced by the brain. So that point of view is being challenged, or it's been challenged ever since the advent of quantum mechanics, actually. But it's becoming more and more, it's being questioned by more and more people. It's quite true that Stevenson's work, the whole idea of survival of death and reincarnation, really flies in the face and of the assumptions of modern science, and that's the reason for the resistance on the part of so many. But it really goes back to this philosophical position of science, and it is just a philosophical position, because science should be. It's not always is. It ought to be about data, right?
Yep.
Following data,
Yep.
Developing theories, testing them, and science changes. There are a lot of things that science used to take for granted that are now not.
Absolutely.
And so things do change, and they change. They change it in accordance with the data, or ought to. And so Stevenson's data sort of challenges that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
It just, it doesn't mean the data is wrong. It may mean that the philosophical point of view is wrong.
Absolutely. Right. That's fantastic. Actually, I did want to just to encapsulate the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson and who he was. If you can just confirm for me, he was really, there were people throughout history who have kind of poked around in this area of past life memories and so forth over the last couple of 100 years or so. But Ian Stevenson was really the first to systematically, comprehensively, rigorously and consistently investigate, document and analyse this field. And I believe he gathered over the course of about 50 years some 2,500 cases.
Yes, that's all. That is correct. Yes, that's correct.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, whether his career was 40 years or, he died in 2000. He started the really systematic study in 1961, and he died in 2007. So,
yeah,
maybe 47 years, but that's close enough.
All right, and you've already you've basically touched on the impact statement that I wanted to kick out with in this interview, which is that the indications of this evidence has the power to fundamentally change the way we see the world and the nature of consciousness and essentially who we are and what we are.
Yes, absolutely it does.
It's exciting stuff. All right, so let's go wind back a little bit and just talk about your personal journey into this. I mean, can you tell us the story about how you got involved in this field of study? I mean, starting out as a PhD and anthropologist PhD, and how did you progress to this day of being pretty much one of the most knowledgeable people in the world in this particular niche?
Right. Well, this goes back well before the anthropology, actually. My first choice of career, my intention was to be a writer, a creative writer, a novelist. But I found after I finished college that it was much harder than I imagined to make a living at that. So I was looking around. So I thought, well, maybe I should try nonfiction. And so I was looking around in my local library, public library, for something to write about. And I really, this is 1980 or so. And I really, I didn't really know anything about parapsychology or about reincarnation or about survival research. I wasn't even aware that it was there. But I had sort of become interested in these things. I finished college in 1973, and that was the New Age stuff was just beginning to be big then. And when I was in college, I was interested I majored in English because I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
But I minored in psychology because that was that was a real interest in mine.
Yep.
But the psychology that I was taught was really behaviorist psychology, which by the time I graduated, I was really questioning. And so I began to read more and more in the New Age sort of stuff.
Yep.
And that interested me in these areas. And so when I found the books on reincarnation in my library there, I thought, this is interesting. And so I started reading on it. And very quickly, then I found Stevenson's work. And Stevenson led me into parapsychology or psychical research, And so I then quickly became professionally involved in psychical research, and that's how I went to the ASPR and so forth. So my first career then was, but at the same time, I mean, I was a librarian.
Sorry, can I just jump in there?
Sure.
Okay, I just want to back up to that point where you started looking at the sort of new agey reincarnation stuff. I mean, a lot of people would look at that and they would stop right there because that's already a kind of a slushy, disreputable, shady and very nebulous, and there's a lot of hogwash in amongst all of that. Why do you think
absolutely
you continued with it? I mean, you're a trained academic, a hard-headed thinker. What made you continue on where most people would just go, well, I'm not going to waste my time here?
Finding Stevenson's work.
Yeah.
In the first area, I mean, I was in the 70s. I was actually a member of a Seth group, and the first books I read on reincarnation were actually hypnotic regression works.
Right.
But then when I found Stevenson, I moved away from all of that very quickly.
Right.
I mean, once I realized that there is a serious academic field here that is looking at this stuff really seriously, and so it's not just channeled teachings like Seth's, or it's not just, hypnotic regression, but actually investigating memories of children that can be confirmed. I
Right.
mean, this is what Stevenson did, you see.
Yeah.
He went out and he investigated children who had memories of people that could be shown to have existed.
Yeah.
And
right.
that's what he had 25, he had 25, actually about 1,700 of those 2,500 cases were ones that he had actually, that were solved, is the term we use, where the previous person has been identified.
Yeah, right. You've made a clear distinction between spontaneous memories in children and those memories which are dug out through regression. What is the difference between those two different types of memories, and why is it important?
I think it's extremely important, and there are a lot of different differences. But I think they go back. I think the reason. Let me start off with the reason, then I'll explain some of them. The reason for the difference is that the spontaneous memories are just that. They're involuntary, they're spontaneous. They just come up, whether in the waking state or in dreams sometimes.
Yep.
Under hypnosis, or even if under regression that's not under hypnosis, they're elicited. That is, people are trying intentionally to remember. They're not just involuntary, spontaneously coming to them. They're intentionally trying to. And you may have the hypnotist, making the suggestion. The suggestion is there, either from themselves or from the hypnotist, that they're going to remember previous lives. And it's that suggestion which I think is what creates the problems. And I think it has to do, and this gets into my theory of past life memory, really. And I believe that they're in the subconscious. All of our memories are recorded in our subconscious, and that's how they get transferred then to the next life, to our consciousness, which includes the subconscious.
Right, that's a really important point. Okay, and I thought another aspect to this also was the idea that when you regress adults, it's very easy to object to anything that they might say, because you can just say, well, they could have picked that information up some other way.
Right, and that's the reason that Stevenson preferred to work with children. Although, he also studied adults sometimes too, when he thought the adult cases was worth it was worth studying, was worth putting his resources into. And there are some good adult cases. There are some good cases that that go beyond what we get with children even. But yes, I mean, that's one major concern, is that with children you can more easily rule out the possibilities that they've heard something, or they read something, seen something.
And one of the things that's come up, I see, is, and I do believe this is true, it seems kind of just coincidentally that when people do regressions, that they all too frequently turn out to be somebody who was famous in their previous life. What do you think that's all about?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of pushback on that statement. I've made it myself, and I get a lot of pushback from regression therapists saying, "Oh no, that's not true. That most of the people who are called under hypnosis are not famous people." So I've learned not to say that myself, because apparently it's not true. But what is true is that we much more often hear about them in regressions than we do in spontaneous cases.
Right.
Although with adults we do. I mean, with adults, there are all sorts of people who remember having been, Nicholas Romanoff or Marilyn Monroe or somebody like that.
Yep.
And I think it's because they have just these fragmentary memories, and they're trying to match them with somebody. And of course, famous people, there's much more known about them, right?
They stand out.
They're famous, and and so it's easier to find information about them. And so when they're trying to to match up their fragmentary memories to somebody, they naturally come to them. I think that's the way we explain it.
All right, and so now, what other sorts of patterns do we see? I mean, I'm thinking along the lines of things like birthmarks and other sort of defects. And I remember particularly in one of Dr. Stevenson's books, he does a number of case studies, and then he draws sort of generalities about them, about all of these cases. Like, for example, the fact that there's an overproportion of people who have died in an untimely way, or all those sorts of things. Can you just speak to that for a moment about what stands out about these cases that sort of ties them all together and shows some similar traits amongst them?
Yes. I get one of the first things is the young age in most of these cases. The children who have these memories will usually start talking about them between ages 2 and 5, so very young. Very often, as soon as they start to talk, they'll say something that turns out to be related to it, to their memories.
Yep.
Although, later on, as they become more able to talk, the things will become clearer.
And they'll refer to their other mother and dad and stuff like that, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Then after a few years, the memories seem to fade.
Yep.
And that Stevenson used to say between the ages 5 and 8, and that's a general rule of thumb. My daughter actually is one of these children who had these memories, and she retained hers until she was 12. Rylan is now 12, although she doesn't talk much about her memories anymore. I'm told that she still says she remembers things.
Yep. Okay.
So, the retention past late childhood is certainly possible.
Yeah.
And there have actually been studies of that. Erlander Harrelson, whom I mentioned earlier, is my co-author of the first book I wrote, has done studies in Sri Lanka and Lebanon of adults who, as children, recalled previous lives to see whether they had retained memories. And in a good number of cases, they did. As many as a third of them in Lebanon, among the Druze people.
Right.
I think one thing that's important is to divide them between the patterns that relate to the case subject, the person who has the memories, and patterns that relate to the previous person, right?
Yep.
The person whose life is recalled. That's two different things, right? And so the age then applies to the case subject. But there are other things that apply to the previous person. For instance, you mentioned the violent deaths. Well, there are violent deaths in maybe about half of cases. That is, in every culture, we find this sort of thing, not necessarily half, sometimes more than that. But we find in every culture that there are more deaths, significantly, a lot more deaths, violent deaths than there are of all deaths, in that culture, in that population.
Yeah.
So something is going on here. That is beyond chance, right? And so it requires some sort of explanation, and the explanation for that may simply be the violent deaths are more memorable.
Yeah, it's not just violent deaths; it's untimely deaths as well, like due to a fever or a car accident, or something like that, right? Or even suicide, I believe, is a case as well, right?
Yes.
Yes. It seems to be there's a tendency for memories to be retained when the life is cut short in an untimely way. It's cut short. It hasn't been brought to a satisfactory end.
Yes, that's right.
And so somehow it seems to me that there's a relationship between that and the fact that the life is remembered.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, Stevenson pointed out that in the great majority of his cases, that there was some sort of incompleteness
Yeah.
Unfinished business.
Unfinished business.
And so that's what you're speaking to, right?
Yeah.
Right. And but now we also have some cases of natural deaths in old age. So it's not, they're a minority. They're, a small minority actually, but they exist. So it does look like we're dealing with past life memory and not something that gives us clues about reincarnation in and of itself. In other words, we can't say that untimely deaths lead to reincarnation, whereas other kinds of deaths don't. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the case. But early deaths also, particularly with young children, the younger the child when they die, and then that's typically, from some sort of illness when they die young, although, it can also be accidental. But the younger the age of death, the more likely the memory is to be recalled.
Right. That's interesting.
So that also plays into this. Yeah, it is interesting, but that also plays into this unfinished business. Also, with with very young children, the return tends to be in the same family, the same nuclear family. Yes. So let me just conclude that pattern thing by referring people to something that I wrote that's available on the web. I've done a series of articles on reincarnation cases, and for the Psi Encyclopedia, which is something that's put out by sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in London, and it's simply called. It's something like patterns in reincarnation cases, or reincarnation-based patterns, or something like that. But if if your listeners want to search for something like that and Psi Encyclopedia, they should be able to bring that up, and that has a lot more information about the basic patterns that we see. There are a number of others, but anyway, to go on then.
All right. So, and medical records. So there's been corroboration of medical records and the way people have died, and then that matching up with bullet wounds or knife wounds, and then matching that up with birthmarks and things like that.
Yeah. So sometimes there can be multiple birthmarks, particularly with gunshots, because there's one for the entry wound and there's one for the exit. Right.
Right.
And so, your medical records will show this, and they match up to what the birthmarks on the child are. It's kind of hard to explain a lot of this by coincidence,
So yeah, that's a really extraordinary thing.
Yes, it's not only that, but we know that with gunshots, the entry wound is usually smaller. It tends to be round, and the exit wound tends to be much less defined and to be larger. Well, this is forensically, the case. Well, that's what we see in the birthmarks too. The entry birthmark is small and round, and the exit birthmark is much less defined and larger.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's truly amazing. And, a lot of the birthmarks, and it's not just birthmarks, it can also be deformities, bodily deformities and things that Stevenson documented. Whenever he could, he got the medical records, autopsy records that related to them, related to these injuries, to see how well they matched up. And when he was able to, they generally did. Now, there's something interesting there too, in that the medical reports, the autopsy reports, often show more wounds than there are birthmarks.
Right.
So the thinking there is that the wounds that were caused earliest, and that is before a person lost consciousness, are the most likely then to be reproduced.
Right. Okay.
Which suggests that, right, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If one assumes that consciousness is somehow involved. And this is exactly, I think, is what is going on. I think that the production of birthmarks is very much a psychogenic thing. That is, the mind produces it.
Right. It's incredible.
Maybe I don't need to elaborate that point anymore.
No, that's really amazing. I actually hadn't heard that before.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much about this. So you can see how, once I stumbled on this, I just could not let it go. I mean,
Right.
for all these years.
Right. So I'm fascinated to hear about what you would consider to be one of the most striking cases in terms of the level of detail, corroborated detail that there is. For example, I remember I was quite astonished at a particular, or impressed by a particular case. I believe the young girl was in Turkey, and she could remember something like 23 names of relatives and friends of a previous personality, and name every single one of them and describe accurately the type of relationship she had in her previous life with each one of those people. I just thought it was a phenomenal number of names to be able to accurately remember. They identified the previous person and confirmed what she had told them about those relationships. You just can't put that down to coincidence. Are there any more cases like that you can think of which are striking like that?
Well, there are a number of them. First of all, I think that case was actually in Lebanon, not in Turkey.
Right.
That was a Druze case. There are a number of other cases that are almost as striking as that in terms of the things that are recalled. There's an American case, actually, Ryan Hammonds, who may have the record number of things that are recalled. That's still documented. His mother, before the case was solved, began keeping a journal, a detailed journal of all of his statements. And so at last count, there are about 250 of them.
Wow.
They sort of dropped off now. I mean, he doesn't talk about it much anymore. But yeah, that's quite a few, isn't it?
What sort of stuff does he remember?
Oh, he was recalling the life of somebody who turned out to be the head of a talent agency in Hollywood.
Right.
And so he would remember the person's house. He would remember his talent agency. He would remember, the names of his family, his previous family, all in his, and the fact that he had adopted 3 sons shortly before he died. Had given them his name. And one of the things that was driving him, the unfinished business in his case, was that he wanted to get back in touch with his sons because he felt like, he hadn't given them enough time and so forth. And he felt like he had he wanted to heal the relationship with his sons.
Right.
Unfortunately, he was never able to meet them, although he did meet the previous person's daughter. But, but on and on and on and on with very detailed memories.
All right, so which brings me to another question area that I wanted to get your comment on is just around, obviously a lot of people are going to be skeptical about this sort of stuff. It doesn't really tally with their understanding due to science, or it may conflict with their religious beliefs that we can only get one physical body. How solid is this data really? How well corroborated is it? And has it been independently peer reviewed?
Oh, those are 3 different questions. For the independently peer review, absolutely. I mean, Stevenson was, we haven't really talked about his background, but, he was a mainstream scientist, a medical researcher, and then a psychiatrist before he started this. Research, he published not just in the journals of parapsychology, which are peer-reviewed, after all, but also in mainstream journals in psychiatry and in anthropology. So yeah, I mean, a lot of his studies, were probably all of his studies. He really took pride and went out of his way, to try to reach an academic audience with it. So yes, he published only in peer-reviewed journals, or almost entirely in peer-reviewed journals. So there's quite a lot, available here. And others like Erlander, who have followed him, have also published in peer-reviewed journals. So all this research, the basic research that I've been talking about, it does come from peer-reviewed sources. So what were the other questions?
How solid and consistent and well corroborated is the data?
Okay. It's very consistent. And this is, you see, we have all of these cases now, and we can see these patterns.
Yeah.
And it's not just the patterns in the reincarnation cases. It's that the reincarnation cases are consistent with the research that's done in a number of other areas in psychical research related to survival of death, right? Apparition cases, mediumship cases, and so forth. It's all highly consistent.
Right.
Also, it's not just Stevenson who is finding these cases. Erlander, I mentioned, that I've been investigating cases. There are a number of other people too. Jim Tucker is well known. He's Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia. So there are a number of other investigators. Plus, when we actually went back, and started looking for them, we found that there were a lot of cases. I say we here. Stevenson started this, and he wrote a review paper in 1960, actually before he first went into the field, and he had 44 cases at that point.
Right.
That he found, he published records of. Right. This is before 1960. Well, I found some additional ones, another of my Sciencyclopedia pieces was on cases from before 1900.
Right.
I haven't tried to pull everything before 1960 together yet, but before 1900, I think I've got 19 cases now. I think that's the correct number.
Right.
Of cases that were reported before 1900. And the significant thing there is obviously we're dealing with somebody other than Stevenson, right? Other than the researchers today. So the point I'm trying to get at is that these cases have been reported from a lot of different people, right? And over a very long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And yet they're very similar.
So what about the possibility that the people who are providing the information are just perpetrating some kind of a fraud or hoax, and the researcher has just been sucked in by it?
Right. This is something that skeptics like to say or allege, but on no foundation. I mean, it's easy to say things. If Stevenson found very, very few cases in which things like that do seem to explain the cases. He was a look at. I mean, this is what researching a case is about. Evaluating these things, and he did find a few cases, and he wrote about them, in which the parents had imposed the identification very clearly, or the whole case seemed to be invented from whole cloth by the author of the report. But not very many of those. Really, not very many of them.
So how does he go about ruling out a hoax or a fraud?
By talking to as many people as possible, first-hand witnesses. He worked only with first-hand witnesses,
right?
To a child's statements or behaviors, and interviewing them repeatedly over a period of time to check from the stability of memories and so forth, and then trying to confirm, whenever possible, confirming their memories through written documents. Yeah, like the medical records we were talking about.
Okay. So has anybody ever tried to come up with a conventional explanation for the data that fits with the current mechanistic paradigm? A different interpretation that doesn't fly in the face with sort of the established reductionistic way of seeing things?
Yes, I mean, that's what the skeptics have done. But they, and what they say is, these cases, I mean, the parents, or simply they're imposing the identity on the child. Usually this idea starts from the assumption that the cases are all in cultures that have a belief in reincarnation. And so supposedly the parents from this belief then are either imposing their identity, they're coaching their children, maybe unconsciously to behave in certain ways. But these sorts of explanations they don't work because they don't explain how the parent could have come by the information that matches a deceased person. So the skeptical response there is, well, they didn't really. I mean, that's something that was constructed after the fact. once, maybe the child said something very innocuous. The families believed this had to do with reincarnation. They went out and they found somebody who seemed to fit this, and so then the memories were all reconstructed to say, to make it seem as if the person being recalled was this. Well, this is where the value of the written records come in. Mm-hmm. And, because when you have written records of what the child said before the identification was made, that goes away. And then you're also not dealing simply with the memories. You're also dealing with these behaviors. You're dealing with the physical things, all of which fit together, right? And so you have to come up with some sort of an explanation for them that makes sense. And a lot of the skeptical charges don't really make sense because they're not really taking into account all of the aspects of the cases. They're throwing out these ideas, but they don't really relate them to the cases. They haven't bothered to really study the cases because they're so sure that there can't be anything to them.
Yeah, they're dismissive.
So that they don't want to take the time, and they can't be bothered to actually look at the data.
Yeah, right. No, that's typical, isn't it? So, what about other alternative types of explanations that are non-conventional, but more in the realms of paranormal, like clairvoyance, possession, telepathy? There are other ways that information could have ended up in that child's head.
Well, that's right, and this is where we get to the super psi, as it's called, or super ESP explanation. This was a term that was developed to describe some of the objections to some of the mediumistic data before the reincarnation data began to come in, and then it was extended to the reincarnation stuff. And it basically it holds that the parents are acquiring this information by their psi, or the children perhaps are acquiring it by their psi. If it's the parents, then we get into the socio-cultural imposition idea. But we have a mechanism then by which the parents could come to this knowledge, right? And with the birthmarks, it said that maternal impression, which is the idea that a mother knowing of certain wounds or things can then impress the child in her womb with these, for the birthmarks or the birth defects in line with them. So these explanations are very complicated, though, because you have to then say that a mother is acquiring all of this information. She's somehow unconsciously mobilizing it to produce the birthmarks, and then after the child is born, she's somehow transferring all this memory to the child without any conscious knowledge of herself that that's what she's doing.
Yeah, it's kind of a long stretch.
Yes, exactly. And this is the problem. You have to do this case after case after case after case. So you get to the point of saying which in the end is more plausible, to believe that or to say, maybe these cases are what they seem to be, And there's just so many of them. And they really have been so well researched by so many people. And they've been reported over so long a time. That I've gotten to the point where I just don't see any other explanation for them.
Did you ever go through a stage where you started to doubt yourself and think maybe I'm just, I'm getting sucked into this and I'm just not seeing the real picture, or did you just?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess at first, when I first started reading these accounts, the birthmarks I couldn't buy. I mean, it took me maybe a couple of years before I started taking them seriously. And because I kept seeing them again and again and again, and that's what finally penetrated it. But at first, I didn't see any way. I was willing to sort of think about, could this be possible? Could we perhaps really survive death? Could reincarnation really be possible? And so, but the birthmarks, just the whole physical thing just threw me. And so I couldn't, it was a long time before I started taking them seriously and thinking, how then do we explain them? And it really wasn't until I was writing the course in my book. The Signs of Reincarnation book is actually based on the lectures that I wrote for that course. And I now use that book as my textbook for the course. But anyway, that's how they relate to it. But in the course of writing my lectures, that's when I realized that if I'm going to teach this course, I need to come up with some sort of a theory. And in developing that theory, that's when I realized, by looking at the data and really thinking about it, I realized, this stuff is psychogenic. It has to be. And then once I realized that it's the mind itself, that consciousness itself is then the reincarnating consciousness, that is what is producing these effects on its new body.
Yeah.
That gave me an understanding for it. And actually, in general, until I started developing these course lectures, I was still hedging. I didn't doubt the data, but and I said this in print as late as 2011, that we had to be careful. Maybe there was some other way to explain this. But then once I began to develop my theory, and once I fit it all together in a way that made sense to me, that's when I shifted from I'm not sure, to I am sure.
Right. So it all changed for you when you were able to create a theory that could just bring all the data together.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So one of the things I've seen come up recently, which was new for me, is that there's a tendency for remembered past lives to be those of meditators. In other words, there seems to be also a connection between people who were meditators and being able to remember in their next life who they were. So it seems like a certain level of consciousness can bring about those memories. Do you think that there's anything that we can do in this life to have an influence over who we are and what we're going to be like in the next life?
That gets into a whole, let me start with, I'm not sure where to start with this. You've mentioned meditation, so let me just get that in.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, we see, particularly with the cases of natural death and old age, we see that very often if the previous persons were meditators, they were religious persons, sometimes monks, other type, even in the West, they tend to be religious type people. So it could be prayer, it doesn't have to be a meditation, but anything that sort of focuses the mind, stills the mind, it seems to help with the memory. And that may be because if consciousness is what carries over, which is what I believe is happening, consciousness survives death and carries over through death till it reincarnates, then qualities of mind developed in one life would naturally persist too, right? And so that quality of mind that's been developed through meditation in one life is going to be there as sort of the baseline for the next life and make it easier for memories to come through. That's how I understand that. Now, more generally, there are cases where people decide before they die where they want to be reborn.
Wow.
And then apparently do.
That's amazing.
Children have these memories and so forth. They can also, and this relates to the psychogenic aspect of the birthmarks, they can even before death say that they're going to be recognized by having certain birthmarks that they then have.
How do you think that works?
Okay, how does this work? One thing we have not talked about is that that in about 20% of cases, actually, in about 20% of these cases, the children will recall not only the previous life, but what we call the intermission between lives.
Right.
Right. 20%. So it's not just a few of them, it's quite a few. And some of the things that they talk about is having seen things, either the death end or the birth end. That is, they'll see the body, the disposal of the body, for instance, or they will see their parents, right? That their new parents, right? One example of the latter is James Lineker. He told his mother that he had seen his parents on a visit to Hawaii. They had vacationed. They were living in San Francisco at the time. They'd gone out to Hawaii on vacation. He described accurately the hotel that they had stayed in, and he said that he had seen them also having dinner on the beach. In fact, they had dinner on the beach. And this has occurred some months before his conception. Now, he recalled having been a flyer, a Navy flyer during World War II who had died off Iwo Jima. Well, the fleet would have sailed out of Pearl Harbor, which of course is in Hawaii. So it's as if he was going back, to his home base after his death, and that's where he encountered his new parents. So you get things like that, but I'm talking about how the selection of the parents comes about.
Right.
Sometimes the selection is into the same family, or particularly in the case of young children, the same nuclear family, or it can be just to a more distant relative, or to a friend sometimes, or it can be to a stranger. But and all of these different possibilities come up in the intermission memories.
Right.
And so, and what's interesting here is that even when there's a stranger relationship between the families, they'll talk about having some sort of emotional draw. There's something that draws them to their new parents, something they like about them, something, oftentimes an emotional quality that they feel. The key thing in reincarnation seems to be the emotional aspect of it, but it also, when we look at these the intermission memories, we often see that conscious intent, for whatever reason, does play a big role. And so it's not that much of a surprise to see that conscious intent can be expressed before death, right? So what that suggests is that if one really wants to be reborn in a certain place, if one concentrates on that, before death, and particularly maybe at the time of death, then that one is increasing the possibility of actually bringing that off.
Wow, that's incredible. That lines really well with some of the statements from Eastern philosophy about this.
It does, yes.
Yeah. So, all right, this is going to be my last question. Through this research that you've done and the revelations and insights you've had as a result of what you've drawn out of all of this data that you've been looking at for many years now, has any of this made you make changes to your current lifestyle, perhaps with a view for where you're going in your next?
No, I don't think it has really. I think partly because I don't really, what your question almost hints at is this idea of that reincarnation is about advancement or spiritual growth, yes, and we just don't see that. Right. I don't know if that's really what was behind it, but that's sort of what it hinted to me. And because I don't see evidence for that, I haven't really tried to do anything in my present life. Now, what it has made me want to do is he has to make a decision about pick out somebody, a child, right, in my extended family, to who I want to be my new mother, right?
Yeah, right.
So that I can inherit basically what I have now and pick up where I leave off.
So continue your work.
It's made me. That's what it's done.
I guess that question was multifaceted. So yeah, I think definitely the spiritual advancement sort of idea, but also yes, continuing your work is definitely a big part of it. But for me personally, if I take this model of migrating consciousness, it seems to me that I came into this life with pre-existing conditions that have dogged me my whole life, and they seem to have started right from the beginning and carried on all the way through. When I look back on my life in retrospect, and they haven't necessarily come about due to upbringing or the environment, but it's more like I've been predisposed towards a certain mentality and way of responding to things that, looking back, have unnecessarily held me back. And it seems like something that I need to overcome. Otherwise, I understand you carry on traits from one life to the next, as you've discovered in your research.
Right.
And so I really want to resolve that. If there's one thing that I can learn in this life, I want to be able to resolve that so that I'm not carrying it with me into the future moving forward.
Right. And that gets to something actually, that I think it is important to get in. And that is, although we don't see much evidence of spiritual development or progress, we do see very much the carryover of
traits
of personality, and that includes these sorts of conflicts and problems. And yes, like you, I recognize these failings in myself, and I have tried consciously to deal with them in this life, knowing that if I don't deal with them, I have a good chance of carrying them over, and I don't really want that, right?
Spot on.
I don't want to face the same issues in the next life as I'm facing in this one. So yes, and that I'm like you in that respect, I guess I'm saying.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Jim, it's been my absolute pleasure and honour to have you speaking with me on Ramjam today. Thank you very, very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you again for the invitation.